This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My conversation today, something that I love, speaking with Harvard professors that I never got a chance to learn from in college because I wasn't at Harvard. My guest, Rebecca Henderson. Her new book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. I joke with her, what a title. How did you pick that one right now, spring 2020? Well, she did not. She picked it, as she says, almost a year earlier. Where does she go? Where is her thinking on reimagining capitalism? Two big issues core to her thinking: inequality and climate change. Now, I'm sure some of you right now hear that and instantly just got upset. And some of you heard that and instantly felt, oh yes, that's what I think too. Look, we've all got our partisan perspectives. You sure as heck know where I come from. Well, maybe you don't. Maybe that's the cool thing about being a podcast host. You really don't know exactly where I come from. I don't like to think that I'm on a team really anymore. I don't want to be on a team. But given that Rebecca and I jump into some rather controversial topics, you're going to see those team biases jump out. But bear with me, bear with Rebecca, because these are important topics. They're damn important topics, because there is something fundamentally wrong with the current version of capitalism. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Rebecca Henderson. You know, it's funny. I've been doing the podcast for 8 years, and I've noticed in just seems like the last couple months, everybody wants to go straight to FaceTime podcasts. This must be the new thing. I'm in La La Land.
I think it's because we're all using the video so much for other stuff. Do you want me to use a headset and mic?
You sound fine. I don't want to jinx it.
Okay, that's my question. If I sound okay, let's not mess with it.
You sound great. So listen, let me just jump right in. Here I am holding this fine pre-release book in my hands, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And I know that title was picked long before 2020.
It was. It's a year-old title, at least. When I chose it, the world was on fire. Australia was burning, California was burning, and it was politically crazy. The title's not only physical, but metaphorical. I think our societies are on fire.
It's a fantastic title for the moment that humanity has now stepped forward into. So listen, let me ask a question. I want to know about you, because this is a title that can get heated. This is a topic that can get heated. There can be differences of opinions. What kind of person are you? Are you a fighter? Are you opinionated? Do you like to find collaboration? Where do you come at this particular topic?
I'm British. I'm super polite. When I first began studying climate change, I thought that no problem. We were going to have sensible climate regulation, that we were going to make people pay the social cost of burning fossil fuels. Every time I drove my car, I'd pay an extra nickel because fossil fuels cause health damage and climate damage. I would drive my car a little less, and there would be incentives to develop electric cars. And hey, we would fix this problem. I started studying climate change about 15 years ago. It seemed clear to me that with a little sensible government policy, we could solve it in 20 years. And I still think that's the case. I think if we'd started to act 10, 15 years ago, we would be in a totally different place. Now I've become a little more anxious and a little more aggressive because I don't think we have that much time. I worry that the kind of terrible suffering we're seeing with the coronavirus is a preview of the suffering we're going to see with climate change, and it scares the bejesus out of me.
Let me give you the partisan pushback. I can imagine some of my audience out there right now, and I can't profess to be any kind of a climate change expert. I'm kind of like a man on the street kind of guy who's going to probe you for some insights. But I can see some folks saying, Al Gore came out so long ago and he had the film and there was all these predictions that things were going to happen 20 years ago. And then people were making predictions in the 70s that something was going to happen in the 90s. How do you address folks like that? Because I think the real issue is not that we can come up with a specific time frame, but just the fact that we all instinctively know that if we pollute the hell out of everything and we make a big mess, it's going to be a problem. We all know that. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. I think the issue then becomes what, when, how. Does anyone really truly disagree that humanity has an effect on climate, the environment, etc.? We all know that's true. It's just, it becomes the details, right?
Can I add a wrinkle?
Sure.
At a time when vast majority of the scientists say, well, we said X was going to happen, like less ice in the Arctic, and wow, less ice in the Arctic. And we said the summers would get hotter, and wow, the summers have got hotter. And they said, well, we'd have droughts, and we're starting to have droughts. So maybe they're wrong. Maybe their timetable isn't exactly right. But do you want to take the risk? That's what I say to my friends who are of a different political persuasion. I say, maybe you're right. Maybe this is going to take 50 years to play out. I really hope you're right. That would be fabulous. But how much do you want to put on the line? When the governor of the Bank of England says we're looking at multi-trillion-dollar potential catastrophic risk, is doing nothing the sensible course? Because I'm with you, as we throw this stuff out the window, the idea that it's going to have no effect seems unlikely. So I just want to hedge against that risk.
So I'm going to be probably your only person you're going to speak to on an interview, American who happens to be in one of these communist countries they call communist, but all I see is economic development all day long. It's one of these odd things that takes place in a place like China or Vietnam. But on the flip side, we all know when you look at the details, the stats, etc., that if we don't have China on board with the messaging where you would like us to think, that's a real problem, isn't it?
It's a huge problem. I think the good news is China at the moment is more on board than the US is. China is leading in the production of solar power, is leading in putting in nuclear power plants, is really aggressively trying to decarbonize their economy. Now, it's true, at the same time, they're continuing to burn coal, but they have the energy needs of billions of people to take care of. I think the odds are good that China will be a leader in this area. I don't know. What do you think?
How do we get both sides on the same page at the same time? Because I would think, especially now that we're looking at this whole kind of supply chain, the world is so interconnected. If one group, let's say America says, you know what, we're going to give Mr. Musk all the money. We're going electric cars tomorrow. We're going to really do our level-headed best. But China doesn't. Now, it just seems like if something like that happens, there's going to be an economic advantage towards China. I think this interconnected global system that we're in really is difficult when there is not, and let me go partisan, well, it's not partisan, but let me go controversial. People out there hear the New World Order. There isn't a New World Order. There's each country fighting for their own thing and on their own time frame with their own populations.
I'm super afraid the US is going to be left behind in exactly this fight. There's much more investment in electric vehicles and in clean energy in China than there is in the US. I'm afraid they're getting control of the key technologies, that they're learning how to deploy them in ways that we are not. One of the reasons I'm so keen for the US to move is I think these are the industries of the future. I think really understanding electric vehicles, understanding renewable power, it's going to be much cleaner. Millions of people die every year because we continue to buy fossil fuel, many of them in the US. So China sees that. China is moving ahead significantly faster than we are to get ahead of this thing. And in doing so, I think positioning itself to be the leader of the economy.
As we start to kind of unpack some of these topic areas over the next short while, there's really two key overarching points to this work that you've put together. And that is the climate change, which we've been talking about, but also income inequality, solving that. It's both things. How did you come up with the idea of bringing those two together under the idea of saying, if we're going to reimagine capitalism, this is where it starts?
My students insisted that if I was going to talk about climate change, I had to talk about inequality at the same time. They said, look, the world faces two enormous problems. On the one hand, we are polluting like heck. And on the other, we're leaving behind those people who, through no fault of their own, are just finding it harder and harder to get by. And in both cases, what's happening is that a few people are over-focusing on the current moment, on me right now. And we're losing focus on us as a community that needs to thrive together if we're going to survive together, and on the longer term. And for me, inequality is like climate change. We're tempted to think it's not our job. I mean, I'm on the board of two major companies, one of which is a Fortune 200 company. And so I know that running a company is a ton of work, and that one's job is to give a good return to one's investors and create great products and create fantastic jobs. I mean, that's great. You should know I'm a huge fan of capitalism. I teach at the Harvard Business School. I think it's one of the human race's greatest inventions. But capitalism produces inequality as a feature, not a bug. And we don't begrudge Bill Gates his fortune because, hey, he came up with some fantastic ideas and created a great deal of value, and he's way rich, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when we start to neglect the people at the very bottom, when they can no longer play the game that we're all playing, when they lack the education or the healthcare or they're not in the mix, when they cannot compete on a level playing field with the rest of us, that's not fair. That's not free market capitalism. That's a kind of skewed way to play. Social mobility in the States is dropping. I mean, the American dream is one of the things that brought me to the States, and it's getting to be less and less true.
Here's a big picture. You already brought up Gates. I was thinking of Bezos. I absolutely, even if I could have differences of opinion on politics or whatnot, I don't even know all of his political stances, but I love the fact that Jeff Bezos has done what he's done. I love it. I think it's great. It's awesome. I salute him. I think it's fantastic that he's made crazy money. However, here's the funny thing that I start to think about. If you have a situation where 50% of America doesn't have $1,000 in the bank, and maybe I've got my stats off a little bit, but it's basically something like that. Half the country literally has no money, nothing they can call on, especially in a moment like right now, for example. If half the country has no money and one guy has 150 billion. Now, I'm not proposing to do anything to Jeff's money. I don't know. Maybe you are. I don't know. I want to hear. I don't know what the solution should be. But damn it, that's a problem. I used to hear about the Walton family, the Walmart family. They would probably have something like 25 to 40%. Their wealth would cover like 25 to 40% of America, that population. And I'm thinking, that's just crazy. Now, what do you do, though? Because these people came up with great ideas. They launched them. These were the rewards. It often happened very fast. I mean, relatively speaking, Amazon happened extremely quick. What do you do in this situation?
3 men have more money than the poorest 50% of the American population.
They would probably agree it's insane too.
Well, we know that Mr. Gates agrees it's insane. He's in the process of giving away an enormous amount of it. We know at least one of them agrees that it's insane. Here's how I think about it. I think that someone like Jeff Bezos deserves to make an absolute killing. I think that's fantastic. He really changed the way we think about distribution. He's really made our lives easier in all kinds of ways. He should make a ton of money. But $150 billion? That's far more money than any human being could ever spend in a lifetime. So I think as you make more and more money, above some threshold, you should start sharing it with the community. Because after all, it's the community that helped you create it. My classic example here is Oprah Winfrey. I think she's just amazing. And she's made billions of dollars of money too, because she's fantastic. But 100 years ago, an entertainer with Oprah's talent would never have made this kind of money. She's made it because we're now a globally interconnected world, because we have television and movies and all kinds of ways to beam her into hundreds of millions of homes, billions of homes. In the same way, Jeff is so rich because he's been able to use modern technology and the fact that the world is so global. Part of his wealth comes from the fact that he's in this incredible society. So I think it's totally fair that he should pay reasonable taxes, and that beyond a certain threshold, those taxes should start to go up because we need that money. The thing we need to do about inequality is make sure that, for example, everyone has access to healthcare.
Before you get to healthcare, I'll jot that down right now. There's another issue to go in. I want to keep it at the how-to, though. As we talk about something, let's say, we talk about Jeff, we talk about the amount of money he has and giving back. Okay, conceptually, I can go there. Now, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I grew up in one of those 6 counties that are the 6 wealthiest counties in the United States of America. And they're only wealthy. They only live in $1.5 million mansions because of the federal government. We have a situation where if we're going to administer the oligarchs and we're going to take some of their pudding away from them, it's going to require manpower to administer it. And so I think the rub becomes, especially for someone that grew up in that DC area, is to see so much wealth kind of just becoming part of the government system. And these things start to blend together where you start to say today, for example, the young lady that lost the presidency to Donald Trump is now worth $250 million. So is politics now become capitalism in America? Has politics now become the place where you go to get rich?
Oh, so...
Yeah, it's a good point, though, Ro. It's a good point.
I say we have 2 problems in America. Capitalism is no longer a free and fair market, and our politics are no longer free and fair politics. We have to get the money out of politics. This is insane how much money is washing through Washington. It's crazy that people are basically lining up to buy the policies that suit them, that they're taking a percentage of everything that's going through. Absolutely. No, just as we need to kind of reimagine capitalism, reimagining capitalism is about reimagining business and reimagining politics, making politics really competitive, really transparent, and run by ordinary people. 74% of Americans think the political system is rigged. They're probably right. This is a huge problem.
When did we go wrong? When did people become like, for example, in Fairfax County, where I grew up, a house in the 70s, 80s was probably $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, whatnot. And literally within 20 years, we had this thing shoot up. Is there a point in time where you can trace where everything just went nuts? Is it some moment in the 80s to where the hedge fund guys went crazy? Some moment in the 90s where the politicians started getting rich? Where can we trace the point to where we all kind of just said, we don't care about right and wrong anymore?
I think it started 50 years ago when some people came to believe that the only thing business needed to worry about was putting its head down and making money. When over the ensuing 20, 30 years, we came to believe that it was fine just to worry about yourself as a politician or as a business person, when we lost sight of the fact that our society requires this careful balance between wealth and ordinary people, between politics and business, when we lost sight of the fact that all of us has responsibility for all of us, when it was okay to go to Washington and buy the policy you needed because, hey, that's maximizing shareholder value. I mean, there's a story in my book about the Walt Disney Company, one of the great US companies that pushed really hard a bill called the Copyright Extension Act. And it would have extended the copyright on, wild coincidence, Disney movies for 30 years, from 60 to 90 years. A panel of Nobel Prize economists wrote a paper saying, wait a moment, that doesn't do any good for ordinary people at all. That it would be much better to give them access to the movies so they can watch them. By extending the copyright, you've made sure that prices are going to go up forever and ever. And they went right ahead and they paid for that bill to go through Congress. And that was great. By my rough estimates, it put, I don't know, $10 to $30 billion to Disney's bottom line, straight out of the pockets of the people who visit the Disney theme parks. It makes me so angry. And what makes me really angry is the kind of assumption that that was okay, that we don't have to look out for everyone, that business is about building a society that works for all of us, not just for making the rich super rich. As I said, I'm happy to make money for investors, absolutely. But let's be careful that in doing so, we don't create a Washington establishment which is basically bloated and flush with money.
Here's another one right in your wheelhouse. My understanding is the dollar amount that the U.S. airlines want for a bailout because of COVID, is $50 billion. But in the last 10 years, they've done $50 billion worth of share buybacks. Look, I mean, even if one is on the right, even if one is completely in agreement with Friedman, what in the heck are we doing when starting March of 09, it looks like markets are going straight down. There's some hanky-panky in D.C., we have a 10-year bull, and now in hindsight, it looks like the 10-year bull was all about companies using debt to buy their shares to boost their share price. What the heck is that?
Anything to raise the share price, including potentially destabilizing the financial system. Yeah, it's crazy.
What's really interesting about your issues, these topics that we're talking about right now, if somebody walks into this conversation and says, I'm hard right, or someone walks in and they say, I'm hard left, it's really hard to stay at those poles when you put everything on the table because it's a fantasy to be to one extreme or the other.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, really. I find myself standing in front of hard left audiences saying, you don't understand. Capitalism is the best chance we have for fixing these problems. Without the innovativeness and drive and productivity and creativity of the private sector, we are completely sunk. I find myself standing in front of hard right audiences saying, I love capitalism, but without some kind of controls, without the shared agreement that the goal is not just making investors rich, but also making everybody rich and making sure we don't drown the planet in pollution, we are going to go to a very bad place. I say to groups of business people all the time that I fear that if we leave these problems unchecked, if we say it's okay to pollute like crazy and we don't care about the people at the bottom, that we will destabilize the whole system, that we will get populist governments that will do crazy economic things. Populism has a horrible track record on both the right and the left, and we'll lose the whole game.
Okay, so back to brass tacks.
Yes.
The word inequality. It's a great word. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. What does it mean to you exactly?
It means that in the US and the UK, in the last 30 years, the vast majority of all the increase in GDP has gone to the top 10% of the population, and people in the bottom 50% have basically seen no pay rise at all.
How does that contrast with going back decades and decades? A shift?
A huge shift. Following World War II, as the economy grew, those gains were pretty evenly shared. Yes, the rich got richer, but people at the bottom saw more money in their paycheck too. That came to an abrupt halt in roughly 1980. Since 1980, since 1990, all the gains at the top, all the gains in the economy have basically gone to people at the top. If I'm living paycheck to paycheck, I'm living on roughly the same amount as my father was living on, my mother was living on. Let me tell you another answer to your question. What inequality means to me is increasingly millions of people in the US do not believe their children will be better off than they are, do not believe that they have a future. That's inequality. It's so corrosive. It's leading to what my colleague Andrew Angus Bergen has called deaths of despair. People thinking that no matter how hard they work, no matter how hard they try, they cannot get ahead. We know that deaths by suicide, from opioid use, are jumping, that more and more people are in pain, more and more people are depressed. That's what inequality means. It's raw suffering for millions of people.
If a kid comes to Harvard, that kid gets a chance to see a wide view of perspectives. They can walk away from Harvard and they can say, you know what? I've seen the entrepreneurial side of the coin. I've seen the working for the man side of the coin. And, I don't want the risk of entrepreneurism, but they do very well at Harvard. They can leave Harvard. They can go to one of the great jobs that's probably going to be stable, even in the middle of a corona crisis. However, I wonder if a lot of America doesn't have a chance to get those perspectives, and that too many people, this is the point that would probably come back and say, what percentage of the responsibility of where so many Americans that are feeling the inequality pinch, what responsibility of it is theirs? For example, if so many families and so many kids grow up today without that Harvard experience, they say, I'm going to go to high school, I'm going to get out, I'm going to get a job. And they don't ever ponder something else. They don't ponder being the business person. They don't ponder being the entrepreneur. That's not part of their thinking. For whatever reason, they're not trained to think that way. It sure seems like that if we could have more people exposed to that kind of thinking, we'd be better off. Whereas it does seem like sometimes we've got this mass of humanity that's waiting for something to happen, waiting for the higher up folks to kind of solve everything for them.
Oh, I hate the idea that the reason the people at the bottom are in trouble is because they're not trying hard enough, because they're not looking around, because they're not taking the risks. Here's what bothers me about it. Why wasn't that true in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? In the 50s and 60s, the odds that someone born in the bottom 25% of the population would go to college, would have a good life, would have a better life than their parents was really quite high. And that's been slipping and slipping and slipping. I don't think it's because people who are born in less fortunate circumstances have somehow turned lazy or foolish. I'm a big believer in that there are smart people born in every kind of house in America, every kind of house in the world. Everywhere people are trying to get ahead and looking at what can happen and taking their chances. I just think it's got a lot harder to be in that position in both the US and the UK. College has got a lot more expensive. People coming out of college with enormous loans, I can see looking at that and quite rationally going like, whoa, I don't want to come out of college with $20,000, $30,000 in loans. If I can't get a job that's going to give me any spare money to be able to pay those loans off, that doesn't make any sense. That seems completely rational to me.
I'm not trying to say that folks are not trying. But on the flip side, as I told you at the top, I'm in a developing country. I mean, there's a lot of economic growth. It's a population, 50% of the population, 100 million people, 50% under the age of 35. They're generally thin, not because of, there's plenty of food, but they're generally thin. And there's a hustle thing. If I look at something like China, I think everyone knows the stats show that we can talk about capitalism and whatnot, but the communists probably brought more people out of poverty since 79 as an absolute number than I don't know, just about any point in time in human history. It's absolutely amazing. If I keep it again, and I'll let you push back on me, but if I keep it again at the personal responsibility part of this, and I look at something like the US, is our obesity epidemic or our OxyContin epidemic, the opioid epidemic, is that more of a result of people just kind of giving up because they can't get ahead? Or is it just a little hedonistic, or is it a combination of both?
You always have both operating. Sure, there are lazy people, there are depressed people, but it's kind of odd that suddenly they're all concentrated in the US in low-income places.
US is the great experiment, huh?
Yeah. I was in India a little while ago and had a chance to talk to some of the people in some of the worst slums. My God, they had the hustle factor. They were working like crazy, but you know what they had that so many people in this country don't? They had hope. They thought that if they worked hard, they could get out, that they could build something. I think what we're looking at in the States, I'm British and I'm very aware of this in parts of Northern England, we're looking at a loss of hope. The sense that the jobs are gone, that no matter how hard I try, I can't get ahead, that the stakes are loaded against me, that other people know the rules and are manipulating them for their own use, and somehow the game is rigged, and it's rigged against me. I think in combination with the fact that, let's be clear, jobs at the bottom are not nearly as good as they were 20, 30 years ago. They don't come with the kind of healthcare they did. They don't come with the kind of benefits they did. Being an entrepreneur is, yes, fantastic, but my God, it's difficult and tough. And the large companies have a leg up in many, many markets. Tons of evidence to suggest that the large companies are gearing things their own way. That takes us back to the political conversation. Yes, always in every society, there are people who don't want to try and want to free ride. Absolutely. The question is, what kinds of tools do we give them such that people go, well, I could stay home on my butt, or I could go do something. In Vietnam and China, they're giving them the tools to say, okay, get out, do that. There's hope. Increasingly in this country, we're not doing that. In this country that prided itself on opportunity and entrepreneurship, it's getting harder and harder to make a way for yourself.
The system is quite complicated. There's no doubt about it. I mentioned the DC area. I mean, that bureaucracy, I mean, there's a lot going on there. I mean, you really have got a ton of things one has to do. Sometimes I share stories or show clips to people outside the States, and something like the lemonade stand and the cops showing up to arrest the little girl. And it seems like that's a metaphor for America right now. It's like you got the little girl out there in her front yard trying to sell lemonade. And we literally in America absolutely do send police to shut her down. That seems like at the ground level, at the local town, city level, if that's our mindset, there's a whole set of tentacles throughout the body politic that we've really got to reconsider.
I mean, I'm sure you've seen the photographs of the Federal Register, the pictures of every piece of legislation ever passed that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, you could argue that the US is simply too big, but that's another whole conversation. Absolutely. I mean, too much regulation is just as much a problem as too much capitalism. Uncontrolled government is just as bad as uncontrolled business. I have a vision, and sometimes I think I'm hopelessly naive, and sometimes I think this is absolutely the way forward. I have a vision where business sits down with politicians to hammer out a system which respects both. You cut back regulation, you cut back red tape, you make sure that the basics are still in place, that business can't do bad stuff, that it has to pay a decent wage and make sure that working conditions are safe and things like that. People have to pay their share of taxes. That's okay. But you make sure that government is full of smart and thoughtful people trying to make the economy work. You make sure that regulations are just absolutely what's needed and totally focused. You make sure that everybody has a chance to participate. That would make us all rich. And it's not so crazy. It happened in the States in the 50s when business, I'm going to use a really tricky word here, unions worked together to build a really prosperous, rapidly growing society. I'm sure we could do it. We're super smart.
Now, let me take you off on the controversial tangent, as you mentioned, the 50s. If we really want to get philosophical here, was the 50s a lucky opportunity for a country that was the only one not on fire and smoldering ashes post-World War II? Did America get its 10, 20-year head start because everybody else was laying on their back?
One of my favorite pictures ever is of the ruins of Berlin in 1946. And underneath it says, following World War II, Germany had an overwhelming industrial advantage. For sure, part of the US success in the 50s was because US infrastructure wasn't bombed to hell. But a much more important part, and I think this is clear in the data, was the enormous size of the US domestic market and the fantastic technological innovation that had come out of the war, and the institutional arrangements, this exact partnership between labor and capital to rebuild America. Remember, everyone expected coming out of the war a massive depression. That's what had happened after World War I. So the experience of World War II, when we saw this huge takeoff, largely fueled by amazing technical innovation. I think the best evidence for that is what happened in Germany. When the Germans got themselves together, my goodness, they built an economy that roared. That the secret to growth, this incredible growth period post-World War II, was capital and labor in balance, talking to each other, building things for the good of the whole, plus fantastic technical change. And I think that's what the States had. I think that's what Germany found its way to. It's what England found its way to, not as strongly, but pretty good in the 70s and 80s. Yes, the war made a difference, but I think it mostly made a difference in kickstarting technical change.
Let me keep it at technical change for a second, and let me drop myself back into 1995. Netscape goes public. I'm pretty excited. I put up a webpage for the first time in 1996. I actually had business occurring online in 1997. I watched this whole bubble go crazy, and everyone's like 98, 99. It's like, wow, off to the races. I mean, is the NASDAQ going to pass the Dow? Boom. Spring of 2000 hits. We get to the fall of 2002, and the economy is still pretty rough. But over that ensuing 2 years, from 2000 to 2002, we did something. And now we all kind of know what we did because we've all watched The Big Short. We dropped rates low. We created a real estate bubble. That sucker popped in 07, 08. And again, as I said in the beginning of this conversation, we did some funny stuff in March of 09. Now we're at 2020. And now I don't know what one calls what's happening right now with the government. I know it's extenuating circumstances. It's a terrible thing. But my gosh, what kind of system can rely on the government to just make up money out of thin air? I mean, it doesn't seem like capitalism or free markets anymore.
Classic left-wing rant. I'm really impressed, Mike. You're super good at this. The system is fundamentally unstable, makes a whole bunch of money for the rich, collapses, gets bailed out by the public, and starts again.
Yeah. It's not nice. I would call it more of a liberty rant, I think. Honestly, I think it's more like, I'm just really tired of watching this happen and then everyone turns around and I see them all on Twitter, all these smart market guys on Twitter, and they all start talking like none of this stuff even happened. 2002 didn't happen. We really didn't drop the rates so low and create the real estate bubble. And 09, we really did do a bunch of funny stuff to get us to 2020. And right now in 2020, we're really not doing all this. Just imagine that it's all pure capitalism, pure markets, and that's it, right?
Oh, well, you know where I want to go with this, and you can stop me. I think we're heading right into a massive carbon bubble, that we haven't priced the damage that our massive fossil fuel emissions are going to cause, and we're going to have an enormous crash as a result.
What kind of crash do you mean? Crash, stock market crash? What kind of crash are you speaking of?
I think the most likely is a repricing of financial assets.
That's the Harvard way of saying a crash.
I'm sorry. Yes. Yes, a financial crash. That we will realize that a very significant part of the economy is wildly overpriced if we take carbon seriously, and that we'll have a sudden correction. Now, you could argue it's happening slowly. As you know, returns in the fossil fuel sector have been drifting lower and lower for the last 10 years. But no, and to your point, this instability is feeding the increase in the size of the government in an irresponsible way. So if every so often you turn around to the government and say, okay, $3 trillion, please, you're putting a lot of non-market people in charge of spending an enormous amount of money. And that makes me super nervous.
You say we think we need the stimulus, but here's the thing. I go back to '02, the bottom of '02. I go back to '09. I mean, now where we say we can spend trillions of dollars within days, why did we even need to do anything in '09? And what was going to happen? It seems like there's a lot of crying wolf. How do we even know that everything is going to go to 1930s depression? I mean, it just seems like if we have a system where there's, as you just said a few seconds ago, if some folks are allowed to take massive risks and they always get bailed out, it just seems like the moral hazards that we're creating, one day we can't bring Lazarus back from the dead.
Oh, I could not agree more. This phrase that we have privatized the profits from taking the risk and socialized the losses, there's an important sense in which that's true. That's why I'm a huge fan of sensible regulation to keep things in balance. That real estate bubble was, I think, quite predictable from the relaxation in regulation in lending and in lending standards. The coming carbon bubble, my goodness, you can absolutely see it coming. It's a refusal to pay the price now.
How will the carbon bubble unfolds for those people out there that are saying, oh my gosh, Mike, I cannot agree with your guest at all. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Explain to people how that carbon bubble will unfold from your perspective.
Let me tell a story. I have no idea if this will happen, but I fear that something like this will happen. So it's 10 years from now, the pandemic is in the past. But we're seeing increasingly large storms routinely hit the major coastal cities. Agriculture has started to fail in Africa. Hundreds of millions of people are migrating north. India and Pakistan are at war over water and threatening to use nuclear weapons. The Chinese are actively trying to expand their sphere of activity to gain access to water and raw materials. There's a particularly bad fire season and hurricane season at the same time. Large parts of the US are on fire. Australia has long ago burnt to a crisp. We have another major storm hitting New York. They're thinking about shutting down Manhattan. The US public and publics everywhere say, okay, we get this. We have to stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow. We don't care, just fix it. The politicians have a mandate to basically get rid of fossil fuels. Trillions of dollars of market cap and value disappear from the markets in a moment. All the big cement companies, their stock prices crash. All the big oil and gas companies, their stock prices crash. All the real estate that's been built in vulnerable locations, like the east coast of Florida, suddenly people say, climate change is real. I'm going to take the price down 30, 40%. Real estate prices crash in Manhattan as people realize that you can build the barrier, but it won't keep the water back. We lose, you name it, a third of the value of the assets, of the financial assets. Massive financial crash. That's what it would look like.
Let me give an example. You just put some projections out there. We don't know if they will happen exactly as you describe or the time frame. I'll give something concrete that's happening right now that might surprise some people listening. The lady in my life is from the Mekong Delta region of Vietnam. This is southern Vietnam. This is one of the world's largest rivers. So her parents are in that area. And if anybody has followed what's happened in China and Cambodia, they have been damming the Mekong at various points. So what happens? In southern Vietnam, down where the delta is, all of a sudden, salt issues with the water's not usable. People are just praying for the rainy season to arrive, April, May, June, because the drinking water has now literally become all bottled stuff. they really can't get fresh water to people effectively. And so that's a here and now, right now, where you can see, you made the point about China and water. Well, there it is. There's what they're doing. They're blocking the Mekong off to build up water reservoirs.
If you saw the floods in Jakarta, millions of people displaced because Jakarta is basically now below sea level, and they're thinking of having to move the whole capital. Or sunny day flooding in Miami, where they keep the pumps going almost all the time to make sure that the waterfront properties are not flooded. There are going to be enormous wars over water. It's going to be bad, Mike.
Yeah, but now on the flip side here, there are plenty of people inland. There's plenty of people inland that don't have those easy breezy tropical views that you get down in Miami. They're saying to themselves, oh, okay, you know what? My grandma always used to tell us that these things could happen. So if you put your house on stilts or if you get right next to the sand, I mean, people can make that argument. Now, I think in an area, for example, like southern Vietnam, I've seen some projections where just 50% of the place could be covered in water. And we're not talking about Miami down there. So I think your point is well made. I mean, there's definitely rising sea levels. I think back to the top of our conversation, the real issue, though, is what can the average person do? What does the average person want to do in lieu of what they're already doing?
It's really important to be aware that we can fix these problems, that the human race has the technology and the resources to address both inequality and climate change. We are very rich and very smart. If we want to stop using fossil fuels and make sure that everyone has a decent shot at life, we can definitely do it. What can the individual person do? The most important, at least in the democratic countries, is to vote, is to insist that our politicians plan for the future. If there's a risk that things could go wrong, let's take out an insurance policy. Let's begin to invest in the technologies that will get us off fossil fuels. Let's invest in education and healthcare in a way that will give everyone a chance in participating. So that's the number one thing, is to get out there and vote and to insist we get money out of politics, please.
We'll redo this conversation in 10 years and see if we got money out of politics.
Bob, we have to keep saying it. It's so important.
Maybe there'll be classes in 10 years that tell people if you actually go to DC, you can become a billionaire in 5 years, working in politics maybe.
Oh, God, but I actually think it would be great to get really good people back in government. One of the things we've done is say that government is bad, that we should drown government in the bathtub. No, we need really competent, well-run government and people who are committed to the greater good. So I think having a load of really good people to go to Washington to work for the people. You remember that old-fashioned idea that you go to Washington to take care of the people? I think that would be fabulous. But I digress. The other thing that ordinary people can do is look around where they work. In so many cases, you can save money right now by reducing fossil fuel use. Walmart took $1 billion a year to the bottom line, just raw profit, straight profit, by improving the efficiency of their trucking fleet. KKR, the private equity firm, those well-known tree huggers, they estimate they're getting a 16-17% rate of return on investments in energy efficiency. There are all kinds of ways to make money in getting ready for this new world. And my belief is the really successful entrepreneurs will be those that see what's coming and get ahead of the curve. That's always been true. It's true now.
You know, I must add, as you brought up KKR, one of my favorite books of all time is a book by George Anders called The Merchants of Debt about KKR.
Betsy, his wife, is my really good friend. I know Betsy and George super well. I love that book.
He's been on the podcast. Yeah. But you know what's so interesting, though, too, is I think it's nice that you say something, I follow KKR forever, but they could probably get a little bit of blame for kind of ripping up the corporate structure and making things all about the shareholder quest, huh? I mean, they really did a number on corporate America.
Absolutely. But to be fair, we let them get away with it. But no, there was a group of super smart, very focused people who decided the way to get rich is to get rid of the limits. Let's focus on making absolutely as much money as possible right now. Let's get rid of the pension plan. Let's lay off these people who've worked for the business for 20 years. Let's cut long-term investments. What the heck? Watch my personal net worth skyrocket. And I think we have to reclaim the idea that there are good ways to make money and there are not so good ways. I mean, no one would say in public, hey, I employ child labor all the time. You know what? It's so profitable. Here's a picture of my yacht. I mean, no one would do that. And I think we have to get back to a place where no one would say, well, yeah, I voted against all the tax increases in my local town. Yeah, the schools are a mess and kids can't get to college, but my taxes, they're still low. I mean, we've got to move away from that, from it being okay to do absolutely anything as long as it makes money. Most business people I know are deeply moral people. They really care about their people and the long term. And it's a kind of fringe of bad actors who are pushing the edge that are really screwing it up for the rest of us.
The book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. In a world on fire in a deep blood red. So you're definitely capturing people's attention. Hey, where can we send people to check your work out?
Check out reimaginingcapitalism.com for links to good bookstores everywhere. I will say, since in the US, Amazon isn't shipping books very quickly, you'll be better off at an independent bookstore. But reimaginingcapitalism.com will get you there.
And I'm not trying to send people to your Harvard page just to have them send you an email, but I must say you responded really quickly, and I wasn't sure you even knew exactly that I was writing you about our interview we were doing today. But anyways, you're very reachable, and again, people should check out your Harvard page as well.
Thank you very much, Mike.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.